Welcome back to part 2 of our Dynasty strategy series. Mitch, last week we talked a lot about startup strategies, some things that were very particular and only relevant to startups, but some things that really carried forward. Today, we want to spend some time talking about what we're doing post startup, right? What we're doing in that first year immediately following the startup. We're in the off season, how we approach it going into the season, and then we had some questions about our rankings and tiers and how that's formulated. What are your thoughts overall on these types of shows? Like, I think it's good to get into our brain, as scary as that could be for people.
It is. So like startups get the clicks, right? Startups is why everybody does Dynasty. It's for the startup draft. Then everything else is the minutia, how you're getting through everything afterwards.
Minutia.
I know, I'm trying to use big words, I don't ask me to spell it because there's no way that's going to happen. But
spelling.
Yeah, it's why we have Google and AI and stuff now. But it's fun, man. I mean, a lot of this is going to break down and depend on how your league was during the startup draft, right? I mean, John and I, we've talked about a lot of times, the league that we met in was crazy. There was trades during the startup draft, immediately afterwards, throughout the season. And I mean, there were so many trades that changed the way that I view Dynasty compared to, there's some leagues to where I had a startup draft. There wasn't a trade during it. There hasn't been a single trade since. And I mean, we're almost to August at this point. Once we hit August, I'm expecting there to be some movement, but so far there's nothing. So there's definitely some varying ways to go about it.
And we get questions all the time, right? Where it's like, hey, how would you approach a league any differently or no change at all that it just isn't active? There aren't many trades that actually happen. And unfortunately, there's nothing you can do.
Yep.
You can try to send trade offers out. You can try to look at trade baits. You can try to look at the needs of the teams. And I think that's the best way to approach it, team need. But if there aren't trades taking place, especially that first off season where the startup took place, it can be so challenging because we've talked about so many times, Mitch, where people being a startup, it wraps up and then I see that maybe I need wide receivers and you need running backs. And I'm like, hey, this makes sense for both of us. I'm going to send this over. And then I get hit with, well, I took this guy 2 rounds earlier in the startup or whatever it may be, especially that first off season, it still comes up.
Oh, all the time. It just happens. It's like, well, no, I took this guy in the second round and now you're offering me someone in the 4th round for him. It's like, it doesn't matter. Like that ship has sailed. The second that you hit that draft button, doesn't matter anymore. It's gone. And so go ahead. No, go ahead, man.
I was just going to say, and you see the way things go in the startups, obviously we spent a lot of time talking about this last week, but you see if it's not an active league, it's probably going to be difficult to get trades done after the fact. If it's a league that fades quarterback, how many times, and we do this too, like we text each other, we message each other, bitching and moaning, I can't believe this didn't even get a counter. And it's like, if certain managers faded a position in the startup, it's going to be very difficult if you hoarded tight ends, if you hoarded quarterbacks to get the value that you think you should be getting. It just doesn't happen that way. So you find teams that lack in a certain position. Well, they lack in that position most likely because they don't value the position.
Exactly. Yeah, if they did, they would have drafted that way in the startup draft. I mean, I'm in the wild west of sleeper random league startups right now, and it's fun. Right now, they're arguing over bad trade offers. I mean, I love leagues like this. It's fantastic, but it's extremely active. That's why I think I might go into the streets a little bit more. I might get off the Dynasty Theory Discord, channel and get out of those startups a little bit and go this Wild West because the draft is completely different. I mean, they're crowning people in the second round on who's going to be the champion of the league already, and they're all very serious about it. It wasn't me, so, I'm bitter. That's why I'm bringing it up. I'm like, of course you chose someone else besides me. But let's just say real quick, you actually are in a league and there just isn't a lot of trades. but you notice it midway through the startup, which is probably by the time you're like, all right, this might be a little bit more of a dead league. So this is going to lead into the whole topic of what are we going to do throughout the off season. The most important thing, if you see that, is you cannot make an old contending team in that league. Don't go old vets and old vets and old vets, because you're never going to be able to churn those. If they ever just don't hit on their value, you're never going to be able to trade them for draft picks or younger players, because first, like you just barely said, the teams probably didn't value them correctly in the first place. And second, it's a dead league, so you're not going to be able to trade them anyways, right? So it turns into this: you have to build super young, and you have to try to make this super team over a 2 to 3 year period, because you can't trade into one over 1 year.
Yeah, that it does get very challenging and kind of getting away from the startups, but more into year one. The biggest thing, it is really difficult to get trades done during that first off season. And you would think as the season approaches, you can find league mates that then start to address their need. But I think in leagues like that, and we did this in a rookie draft. I don't know if you remember, it's kind of a dead league, and we had the 102 and a 12-team super flex this last year. And you and I were both like, there hasn't been a trade in how long? We want Jahmyr Gibbs. Let's just get Jahmyr Gibbs at 102.
I do remember that. Yep.
And
look at us now.
Well, we passed on CJ Stroud.
Everybody passed on CJ Stroud last year.
But anyway, it paid off from hey, we got our guy. It worked out. Could have worked out better, sure. But if you're in a league where you're stashing value at one position because you value it significantly over your league submarket, it is really difficult to eventually recoup that value and to put yourself in a spot to be a true contender over time. Because if you're just stashing tight ends over and over and over again, you're going to be lacking elsewhere. And this is with the assumption that you're not going to have a trade market beyond the startup, right?
Exactly.
Maybe it changes, but most likely it doesn't.
That's the question we get asked the most often in the Discord. And it's been this way for 4 or 5 years of doing this podcast now, or the YouTube, whatever we want to call it at this point. People will stack quarterbacks because they're like, hey, quarterbacks have value, so they'll have 4 to 5 of them. And they'll have a whole bunch of tight ends because it's a tight end premium league. Hey, everyone should value these. But then they have a whole bunch of guys that are sitting on the bench because there's not enough starting spots to actually start them. So they sit on your team. Like I have a team in a Dynasty Theory. I think it's number 3 or number 4. It's a league that you commish. I have this last year I had 5 starting quarterbacks. Couldn't move one the entire season. Just couldn't move one. And I mean, one of them was like Derek Carr, and I think one was Geno. I think the other was Daniel Jones, but I could be off on that. But it's what happens is you're like, hey, this is what's going to happen. Someone's going to value these guys at some point. And usually it pays off. And then you're able to move them, get a little bit more positional value out of it. But if you can't, those guys just sit there and they sit. And then just like you just said, your starting roster is worse. Your depth is much worse because you have 5 at this position that should have value, but nobody values it there.
Yeah. Let me ask you. So again, this is post startup. All the conversations we have every episode, they kind of all blend together. They overlap. It isn't just 2, circles that aren't touching, but we're going through it. We're after the startup. Do you ever find yourself, you went through the startup, you went super young, maybe you were able to acquire draft picks through the draft for future rookie years.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're like, season's rolling around. Maybe I just want to flip to a contender. Do you ever have times like that where you go through the startup, you have a strategy, and then you do the old switcheroo before the season comes around?
Honestly, if I had 10 teams, I would probably do that. But now that I have 40 or 50 dynasty leagues at this point, I use those as kind of my back burner teams in the season. So I really like to keep those ones young and build for the future and try to build a super team out of those, just because of the portfolio approach. I'm not looking at just the player centric part of it. I'm looking at the overall teams altogether. Like having some teams you just don't have to worry about in the season because you kind of want them. They're not bad enough to get the 101, right? But they'll be bad enough to get the 103, 104, and you don't really have to worry about it. But then you have extra picks at the end. Those are some of my favorite teams at this point because I probably have 60% of my roster that is trying to compete that I need to pay extremely close attention to throughout the season. Having those other teams too, where, I'm setting lineups, I'm doing everything that I need to do, going through waivers, but I'm not having to actively shop players to try to compete. I love those teams because I know that they're built for the future. So I'm not hurting it by neglecting it in any way. But, they're just kind of off on their own thing. So, no, honestly, I very rarely do it. Do you do it often?
It's sometimes, and it's only because, and I think it works a little bit better the other way, where maybe you went with a more win now approach. Let's say you have your future draft capital intact, and you went with a more win now approach in your startup from February because veterans were severely undervalued. I think it's easier to go that way and then start to move those veterans as the season approaches because people want those points. And then, okay, I went more with the win now approach because I thought that's where the value was. But now maybe I can find teams that are looking to tier down from one of those higher end assets. And I might be able to consolidate some of these veterans and get points off my roster, get them onto your roster. And maybe I can also get future draft capital. It is really difficult to go the other way unless you're really keen on losing value. So let me ask you this, because now that goes into losing value from a trade perspective. Your startup's over again. I keep reiterating that we are not in the startup. Is there ever a time that we go the other way where you took a player in a certain round and then the rest of the draft went a certain way and your roster construction might be a little funky, where you would be willing to move, we don't want to say like second and fourth round picks, but maybe you're willing to move your ninth round pick for somebody's 11th round pick, that the whatever player that was, because again, now you're loaded with wide receivers because that's how the draft went. But you're like, I want to pick up an extra running back or a tight end.
Yeah, I think this will lead into the second part of the talk today perfectly. I do go a little bit off field. I'm a lot like Dan in that way too, where we will pay attention to what coaches are saying in the off season, to the projections that we're seeing, what we're seeing in underdog drafts. And maybe I just messed up and I overvalued a player. Maybe I was like, I think this guy's a ninth round pick and maybe he still is in startups and that's where his value is. But maybe I just don't like him anymore. Maybe I just don't believe in the fit. And in that case, then, yeah, I am willing to sell him out, take a little bit of a risk to get someone that I like more, or to get more future draft capital that I can move into a player that I like, that I could actually replace that potential value for. That's what I'm doing this time of year. This time of year is, hey, what players do I like moving forward? Look, last year, you and I did projections. We had Austin Eckler very high. We did. So what did I do this time of year? I went out and I got a lot of Austin Eckler. Did it work out? No. It's worked out great for other players in the past, but that was one to where, I was pretty dead set on like, look, we're not going to be this far off on our projections. I mean, we didn't know he was going to have all the injuries and that team was just going to fall completely flat. It happened. It is what it is. And, I end up having a lot of Austin Eckler that I had to churn throughout the season and then going through this offseason. It's like, just give me some sort of value, right?
Yeah, I think it's like you said, attacking the players from a player-centric standpoint, that maybe if you do your projections, if you have your just overall expectations and attacking them specifically as the season gets closer, but also like kind of correcting things in that first off season from a roster construction standpoint. Everybody always says, whether it's a rookie draft, a startup, draft for value, trade for need. And that's kind of where that roster construction correction comes into play. Now, Anything else just on the first year of the league? You just had your startup before we move on to the other topic here.
No, that is honestly the hardest time in Dynasty because everyone drafted a team that they like, more than likely. And if they didn't, they're probably making moves. You're okay there. But more than likely, 10 of the teams drafted teams that they like with players that they like on them. And so you're not going to see a lot of movement until you start seeing the hype that builds through training camp, going into the preseason games, going into week one. That's when you're going to start to see a lot of moves happen. I mean, there's someone like, what's his name? Jermaine Burton, right? If he gets hype this in the first parts of training camp and he does something little bit in week one, his value is going to shoot through the roof. And he doesn't even have to do a lot. He just has to have the hype. So those are the kind of guys that I'm watching in like the post startup kind of time. Those are the guys that I want on my team because I know that they can increase value very fastly compared to like what a veteran can do. Like Rashad Bateman, right? They've talked about him all offseason being good. They've talked, hey, he's doing everything he needs to, yada, yada, yada. But his value hasn't gone up. Nothing's really happened. But these rookies and these first year players, yeah, we could see it a lot. A guy like Jameson Williams, one I have over my shoulder. If he has a really if he's getting the hype throughout training camp, we can actually see his go up a little bit. But it's not going to go up that high because everyone has the 2 years already of existing knowledge of what he is in the league. So those are the kind of guys that I'm hoping to have on my team at this point. That's kind of what I'm doing right before training camp starts.
And one last thing, again, while you were talking, I kind of thought of this, and I really do this with rookie drafts too. Like we always talk about, like, oh, go buy this rookie before training camp, before the season starts. Well, if a player's, let's say their ADP is 205 in a rookie draft, and Mitch has that guy, and I'm like, okay, what can I offer him? But I see he took him at 110.
Yeah.
That's going to be really difficult. And that theme, that overall idea can go towards startups as well. When I'm going through, maybe we just didn't have, maybe we were in the startup and we traded up a ton. So we didn't have those 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th round picks. Or maybe we moved back. So we didn't have those mid-range picks. Mm-hmm. Go through, look at current values, whether it's ADP, Fantasy Calc, KTC, if that's your journey, or if you're using the Dynasty Theory tiers, go through, see where there are market inefficiencies from the overall market value versus where a player was taken in a startup. If they were like 2 rounds later in your startup, and again, you just couldn't trade in, you didn't have picks in that range, whatever the reason is, that's the player that I would be looking to target, as opposed to the guy that Mitch spent a 5th round startup pick on that I wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole until, the 9th.
Completely agree, man. Yeah.
Like so I think that's an easy thing to do. We all spin our wheels here and we're all going through and trying to come up with trade ideas. But if the trade partner is well above market on a player, it's going to be really challenging to get something done, or just get something done at the price tag you're looking to acquire. So I think that's something to keep in mind. This next part of the show, we got this question originally in the Discord. We got a follow-up question about it, and I think it's a really good discussion and a really good talking point here from an overall strategy standpoint. So this isn't startup specific. It's not first year, second year, third year specific. It's just overall. We were asked, how do we use our projections, or maybe just expectations, because we didn't do our projections this year.
I know. I'm still hurt about it. It's okay.
It was just it's a little.
I'm gonna talk you back into it next year. Next year,
maybe. So, how do we use our projections or just expectations for the upcoming season, and then how do we incorporate that into our dynasty tiers or rankings?
See, this is why I love that you have your tiers fully updated all the time, because I use those as like my check. I'm like, so what I will do is I used to go to our projections, but honestly, I mean, this isn't tooting our horn or anything, but we made very conservative projections. That's what we did. We didn't go for the high end. I think we made very good ones. And honestly, they matched up with Mike Clay's 90% of the time, they were extremely close to what he does. So now I just go to his. That's what I've done this whole offseason is I've just pulled up Mike Clay's projections because they'd be pretty close to what we had. And what I'm doing, I'm checking the feelings that I'm having that I'm basing off beat reports, everything that I've heard through the offseason, comparing them to his projections and seeing if I'm higher or lower on someone than I need to be. And then let's say I'm really in love with, let me pick a random player. Let's go with James Cook, right? I'm high on him. I'm like, you know what? Maybe he can be a top 8 running back this year. Going through my teams, getting ready to send out trade offers. Then I'll go over to your tiers because your tiers are perfect as far as where is their actual dynasty value right now. Are they a buy or are they a sell?
You could have stopped after you use the word perfect.
I know. Without a doubt,
tiers are perfect.
Like, they're great. Honestly, this isn't me like, whatever. But you have him listed as running back 14 or whatever he is right now, right? I'm like, all right. So I'm probably a little bit high, but I could probably get him for running back 12 prices and go for there. But I think it's big. You play Dynasty one way, I play Dynasty one way, and Dan plays Dynasty his way, right? They're all different, but we all do well. So Dan is so big on coach speak and what he's seeing in the offseason, what other people are doing in DFS and how to attack them that way, right? That I'm kind of that way, but I do absolutely have to use, I can't just go blindly. Like he'll be like, hey, I want to be 80% of Amari Cooper, whoever it is, right? I have to go to
it was like his Jelani Woods situation because he saw the Cowboys play the Colts.
Yeah, and he had 100%, right? For me, I will 100% do that on a player. I will wake up in the morning and be like, hey, I want as many shares of Jared Goff I can get today, right? And I will trade for him as much as I can. But I will always hedge it by going to your tiers and being like, how overvalued am I at this point? But I don't think you really do that with players that much, do you? Do you ever wake up and be like, Josh Jacobs, I want 15 shares of him, unless someone in the Discord like dares you to do it, and then you'll do it for that reason. But you're not like huge on the whole player take part of this.
I'm not. And like you said, if there is a really in-depth discussion in the Discord, and that's why I love having the Discord community, it's not just for us to provide our thoughts and insight, but it's also to gauge what's going on in the market, because we have our patron channels where it's folks that probably just by talking constantly and being in the same community, ideas start to morph together and values start to morph together. But we have like our general trade community that is not patrons, might not be folks that listen to the show. They don't know my tiers. And it's a great resource, because then you get where am I versus where like our patrons versus where is the general market. And this is without even going to any additional resource like dynastydaddy.com, whatever the source may be, to get a more general idea of the overall market. I always talk about the market versus the sub-market, which is a specific league somebody's in. But if there's a conversation going on, we'll just keep using Josh Jacobs here for the example, and I'm like completely on the other side of 90% of the responses we're getting, then I'm like, okay, let's go test this. If you're saying I should be able to sell him for that, let's go see it. And that, or buy him for that, whatever the case may be. And that's where that comes into play. But overall, like, I have the buys and sells. I'll test the water on that if you're in green on the sheets. So that's kind of where the player thought comes into play. But I look at it within the position. I look at it cross positionally. So let's say I have Brock Purdy as a buy. He might be a buy from an overall value perspective, but within the quarterback landscape, that might not be the case. And then we always talk about that if somebody has a Brock Purdy on the roster, they're probably well above market, a lot of the time. And the endowment effect, like whoever you have on your roster, they are valued more highly than if you didn't have them. That's just how it is. So I would say yes. That's the long-winded way, very long-winded way of saying I'm not as player takey for the most part. And I think you see that with our weekly episodes too, because then I always try to tie it all together at the end. Like my word, overarching, get the overarching strategy. So I think you sum that up really well with like the general projections, your expectation, your value, and then tying it into what the market is, because maybe you don't need to spend nearly as much as you're willing to.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, if anyone's listened for 25 minutes so far on this, I'll just tell you right now, the guy that I want, and this is, everyone's going to agree with this player, but there's a reasoning behind it, is Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson is the guy I want on my teams right now. And it's because I finally realized last year that he has the arm talent of Matthew Stafford. I mean, the guy really does, but he just doesn't use it to that point because he doesn't have to yet. He was a guy I was always worried about. Well, hey, what happens when he loses his rushing ability? I mean, he might lose a little bit of it, but even 33-year-old Lamar Jackson is still going to be faster than most of the NFL. And he has the arm talent to go with it. And they're finally giving him the talent around him to actually produce at that super high level. So, I mean, I know Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen are 1 and 2 because that's who they are. In my opinion, Lamar Jackson should be right up there with them. There isn't a tier. It's those ones. And I'm more than happy to have Lamar Jackson on 80% of my teams because I know I can move him if he gets injured. No big deal. But having what he can do weekly on your teams is huge. And so then I go to it and I'm like, let's say I have a Burrow or I have a Stroud. That immediately turns into me is, hey, I could do an easy 2 for 2 here. I could do my CJ Stroud and this wide receiver for their Lamar Jackson and this running back or whatever, and not really end up losing value, but end up with a whole bunch more rostership of a certain player just because I'm so much higher than them. Then, I mean, I love CJ Stroud. Nothing wrong with CJ Stroud, Joe Burrow, Jalen Hurts, but I do like Lamar Jackson just a little bit more from a safety prospect over the next 3 to 5 years. So that's why I want so much of him. So that's what I do, especially post startups, like we've been talking about this whole episode, is I get really stuck on players like that. And I try to get a whole bunch of rostership over many leagues just because this is how I feel about him at this point.
And as crazy as it sounds, like you look at his startup ADP, you look at the trades that take place, I actually think Lamar Jackson might be the most attainable high-end quarterback.
And I think it's crazy, to be honest with you. Like,
we're not talking about like massive discounts, but I think he's easier at cost versus expected production to get than a CJ Stroud.
Yeah, I mean, we're like, hey, this is a 2-time NFL MVP who at any time can get 35 passing touchdowns and 10 rushing touchdowns, but we will always value Josh Allen over him. That's just how it is in Dynasty right now. Should that happen? Maybe. Maybe there's good reasons behind it. Week to week, I mean, they're the same player, but one's at a pretty big discount off the other one right now.
The last thing, and I just looked at the clock, and then I just messaged Dan and I said we might be a few minutes late for our weekly episode. So the projections, the rankings, the tiers, what goes into it. I'm going to be very quick here. My baseline tiers, they're based on 12-team Superflex, 2 PPR for tight end, start 10, and then a +6, -4 quarterback scoring. And then I calibrate it based on league settings, not like an official calibration, but okay, let's bump this tier up 1. Let's break this tier apart because maybe this is a +4 scoring league for quarterbacks as opposed to 6 or whatever the case may be. Within my tiers, there's a lot that I look at. It's the short-term production in the situation, the expectation, and that what goes into that. It's the historical production, the coaching, the franchise stability, the usage, the peripheral stats in addition to the counting stats, injuries, but then age, contract, market value. If we throw market value out, like, I think it's a critical piece to the puzzle. I really do. So, like, I'm looking at people, players, and I'm like, okay, like Dak Prescott, like I have him above market, but not to take into account the market is crazy. It really is.
Yeah.
So I think that's a critical piece, but those are all the things that when we look at projections, I think those are things that really need to go into it, because the short-term outcomes play a huge role and have massive implications on dynasty values. And we always talk about this, which is such a long-term game, but on a week-to-week basis, it changes so much for people. And you need to take that into account. So those are all things that really go into my tiers. Like, why are my tiers set up the way they are? Well, maybe this group, there's a group that they're older wide receivers. I expect production. They're going to outscore this group of receivers, but they're younger. They have more contract stability. The market value is higher. So maybe that's why they're tiered together. And we could certainly go into more depth here, but we're already at 31 minutes and Dan might have a conniption if we're any later.
Probably. Yeah, it'll happen.
All right. So hopefully everybody enjoyed the show. Like, subscribe, the link for the Discord. It's a free Discord community. Jump in, check it out. If you don't like it, like I always say, bounce. For Mitch, I'm John. Hopefully everybody has a great day. Peace.